All right, good afternoon, or hello, wherever you all might be. Welcome to the webinar on the National Academy of Education Spencer Postdoctoral Fellowship um, application. My name is Jack Busby. I am the Senior Director at the National Academy of Education, overseeing professional development and membership. With me today are my colleagues, Taylor Johnson, Program Officer at the National Academy of Education, and we are also joined by Dr. Deborah Loringer-Ball of the Postdoctoral Selection Committee. Dr. Ball is chair of the Postdoctoral Selection Committee, and she is also the professor of education at the University of Michigan. Welcome to you both. All right, we're going to go ahead and kick things off. I want to make sure, Taylor, are we sharing the PowerPoint? All right. Just 1 second, folks. Great, thank you. All right, so the way we're going to kick off today is here's an overview of our webinar. We're going to review very briefly some technical remarks. We will do an overview of some fellowship information, the online application. Dr. Ball will lead us in a discussion for writing for your audience. And then we're going to kick off generally the last 30 minutes of this webinar for Q&A. So if you have any questions, this is going to be a great opportunity to ask NAEd staff and also the chair of the Postdoctoral Fellowship Selection Committee on just the application as a whole, or even anything to do with the fellowship program itself. We're happy to answer it for you. If we're unable to answer your questions, then please do write us an email, and we will make sure to answer you promptly. So just continuation here on some technical remarks. If you do have any issues, for example, if you cannot hear us right now, then please do write in the Q&A box that you should see in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, I believe. If not, maybe in the bottom center. We will use that in order to be able to also answer your questions. So either throughout the webinar, or if you could save it for the last 30 minutes when we start opening up Q&A, go ahead and put in your question in there, and we will try to make sure to answer it during the open discussion. But again, if we cannot get to your question, please do send us an email. Also, if you're a note taker, please note that we are going to be posting this online within a week, generally on YouTube, and then we'll also make sure to put it on our website. So just in case you do want to rewatch this webinar, you can do so. All right, an overview of fellowship information. While this webinar is primarily about the application process, I do want to briefly discuss benefits of the fellowship. The fellowship is funded by the Spencer Foundation and administered through us, the NAEd. If you are selected, you will receive a non-renewable $70,000 stipend for 1 year, and you will attend 3 fellowship retreats held in the fall of 2024, spring of 2025, and again in the fall of 2025. The fall retreats are held simultaneously with our members' annual meeting. These retreats are a keystone of your fellowship experience, in which you will receive mentorship from a member or former fellow, network with your cohort and our membership, and attend programming related to your professional development. During your second fall retreat, you will present the results of your research as part of our Fellows Forum panels. Please note that retreat attendance is mandatory, as we are really looking to try to build a cohort of participants here. You also have the option to participate in a poster presentation at ARA in 2025. Regarding administration of the fellowship, you may directly administer your funds or request your university to administer them. We support either option and recommend you make this decision in partnership with your department. All right, some eligibility requirements here. You must have had your doctoral degree conferred between January 1st of 2018 and December 31st of 2022. Having your degree conferred means having the degree issued by the university and that you have it in hand. Applicants who graduated after 2022 will have to wait until next year to apply, and there are no exceptions to this policy. There are no residency restrictions for this award. You do not have to live in the United States, work at a U.S. institution, or have earned your degree in the United States, nor are you required to have a formal institutional affiliation. Independent researchers may apply for the Postdoctoral Fellowship, and U.S. citizenship is not required. Your project must be related to education, which we define very broadly. Formal and informal K-12 and adult professional education in or outside the U.S. and more have all been funded and are all considered. We do not allow group applications. IRB approval is required of fellowship recipients, but you do not have to submit the documentation with your application. And also just to note that IRB approval is required if you're going to be observing human subjects. Finally, concurrent funding is not permitted. If you are awarded funding for your project from this postdoctoral fellowship, as well as another source, you must select only one source of funding for your project. And Taylor, I'll hand it off to you.
Okay. Okay, so the screen you see before you is our application portal. So if you experience any difficulties with the online application or something doesn't look right on the portal, please contact the NAEd staff for assistance. It's very important that you make sure that you're applying to the correct fellowship. After creating your login, you will be redirected to this page to choose a fellowship. Make sure that you select the Postdoctoral Fellowship. If you are a previous applicant, you need to start a new application. Our team will not review applications submitted to last year's application portal. The application deadline is November 15th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. You and your references must meet this deadline. This is a hard date and a hard time. We will not accept submissions, additions, or edits after the timeline. Our staff will also not make changes on your behalf. Once the application portal closes November 15th, the NAEd staff will review applications for completeness and general appropriateness. Staff will then assign your application to 2 members of our selection committee. We try to closely align your research to the expertise of these reviewers. However, best matches are often not possible. The committee will present their overview of the application materials during the meeting held in February 2024. In March 2024, we will notify you if you are moving on to the semifinalist stage. If a semifinalist, we will ask you to submit an update to our committee regarding your proposal, timeline, and budget. The updated application materials are to be shared with 2 external reviewers outside of the selection committee. We hold a second selection committee meeting in April of 2024, where we will select 25 finalists. We will then update you on your status May 2024, and our fellowship begins as early as July 2024. You must complete all required fields to submit your application. You must submit all documentation in PDF format and make sure that PDF is not locked. This not only minimizes errors and difficulties for us down the line, but also streamlines your application review. For instance, sometimes transcripts are uploaded that can only be opened by the student or the institution, or access privileges will lock out a reviewer after a certain amount of time. Please be sure to make sure and check none of these securities are in place before updating your PDF. It is also very important to talk to your reference writers well in advance of preparing your application. You want to give them plenty of time to write a strong letter of recommendation, as our selection committee reviews these submissions critically. Remember, they have the same deadline as you do. The application portal will send an automated email when you input the names of your references with instructions and a link to upload their letters. Applications Applicants will receive a confirmation email when the reference letter has been submitted. Throughout the selection process, we will provide written updates by email. It is highly important that the email addresses are imported correctly. Finally, to close the overview of the application, we have 2 points of advice. Well, number 1, all application components, including the letters of recommendation, are due November 15th, 2023 at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. However, we suggest submitting your application ahead of time. Tip number 2. Additionally, since we are a small staff, we typically have difficult time trying to keep up with all applicants and recommendation writers, questions, and individuals who are trying to contact us during the due date. Please plan accordingly and have additional questions addressed before the application deadline. With the application overview complete, I will now turn over the presentation to Dr. Ball, who will talk more about the narrative and your audience.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here and trying to provide more information. Some of the questions that have been coming up in the Q&A we'll address during the part of this session where we'll have opportunities to do that. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the preparation of the proposal and writing for your audience. First, it's important to think about who your audience is. So I'll say a little bit about the committee. The committee is composed of scholars who represent a wide range of methodological and disciplinary expertise, but the committee doesn't necessarily align exactly with your own work. So you want to think a little bit about writing for an expert but generalist audience in the range of fields that comprise education research. In the first stage of the review, the reviewers will be a little bit more aligned, very likely, with your research because they will pick reviewers who are more likely to be familiar with the area of work in which you work. But in the final round, where the committee is reviewing all of the reviews that have come in, you could have to assume that they cover a wide range. I will say that the committee is composed very deliberately to represent a wide range of diversity of identities and kinds of work. And the people who are on the committee are very committed to the mission of this postdoctoral fellowship program, to broadening and deepening the areas of work in our field. They're interested in and open to ideas and approaches that they themselves don't do. But what you're doing is you're writing to explain what you want to do and why it matters. And what the committee brings is expertise and experience in our various fields that comprise education research. So it's not like they're unfamiliar, but they may not be experts at all in exactly what you do. So you want to think a little bit about how you're writing in such a way that that will be possible to communicate as clearly as you can what you want to be doing. Next slide, please. So thinking a little bit about what your audience needs to know. I'd say that an important thing to do is to start talking about what are you curious about and why does that matter so much? You do want to connect what you plan to do to other areas of scholarship that bear on your work. I think a very important thing to be clear about is what your question or questions are, your research questions, what needs to be studied and how does that relate to what has been studied by others and also what hasn't been studied? How are you building on other work in the field? How are you filling in areas that have been overlooked or perhaps not been fully explored that you think are important, whether it's about populations or a certain kind of question or certain settings or building on certain theories. All these parts matter, but they give the committee different angles and perspectives on what you're doing. So the statement of the research, the proposal narrative, of course, matters. We're reviewing that to see what you have in mind, what your design is, how you plan to analyze the data, what data you're going to collect, and so on. But the personal statement is also very important because the mission of the Postdoctoral Fellowship program is also to grow our field, to grow the people who will be carrying forward work in our field in the decades to come, you. So it's important to write, who you are, what you do, what you're bringing to the questions that you're studying, that you want to study, what are the problems that occupy it, how does that relate to your own history and your own experience? The letters that you recruit from people who know you should be as specific as possible. And it's useful perhaps to tell your referees that that's important. So they should be people who know you, who know the kind of work you're trying to do, who have some experience about that way that you'll be able to carry this out. And they really do help. So really, it's people who can attest to your capacity to carry out the work of the project, who've had experience with you. That's what's most important. So specifics are the most helpful to the committee. We'll talk for a minute about what else might be important to talk about. Sorry. So first of all, there's obviously the focus of the proposal. What are your questions? As I said a few minutes ago, what's the problem or problem space that you're occupied with? If the word problem doesn't really resonate for you, then can you say more about what the area is that you want to study and why it's crucial to probe there and why we need to learn more? Why do we need to learn more about it? If your study involves some kind of a sample, whether it's people or sites or programs or policies, it's really important to be as clear as possible about your sample. Why are you picking the sample that you are? Like, why those people? Why that population? Why that site? How does that fit with what you're trying to learn? Why is the size of your sample and the composition of your sample appropriate for what you're trying to study? Making really tight connections between the first part of your narrative where you say what you're interested in, who else has worked on this, and what your questions are, and then the actual design of where you're going to collect data or what you're going to be looking at, whether it's literature or artifacts or people. Explain why that set of areas that you're going to collect evidence from or data or artifacts, why is that appropriate? Think a lot about what kind of claims you expect your project to be able to make, what you're hoping to be able to make, and what's the argument you think you'll be making as you analyze your data, and how will your evidence and your plan and your design and your analysis contribute to you growing your claim, maybe learning that your claim, you need to adjust it or change it, but what are you setting out to try to do to contribute? With respect to the analyses that you talk about, it's really useful to ask yourself, if you looked at what you wrote about your analysis, would it apply to any study or how is it specific to the study that you're actually designing? And often we see a lack of connection between particular methods of analysis and why that's useful to connect to your question and to the sites that you're looking at. An important thing to consider is feasibility. Sometimes because you have wonderful ideas and people have big things they want to study, sometimes the studies that are proposed are really large for the amount of time involved, and the timeline becomes a question, whether it will really be possible to carry out that work in the time indicated. So really ask yourself about the feasibility. I'm so sorry. Just taught for a couple of hours, and I guess I wore out my voice a little bit. So moving on, there's another area that you'll be submitting, which are appendices. It's important to realize that the selection committee isn't required to read those appendices. The volume of the application is always very large. We concentrate primarily on the narrative and other things that you submit, your letters, work samples, but be judicious about what else you include. It may be important to include something, but explain in the narrative like what we should be looking at when we look at the appendices. Don't rely on the appendices to carry information that really should be carried in the narrative. So we know that there are space restrictions, but you need to work hard on getting everything that is crucial for the committee to understand should be in the proposal narrative. So in some sense, what's in the appendices is like elaborating on things that are in the proposal narrative. And I think with that, I think we're going to stop. I know you have lots of questions that have already been coming up in the chat, and we'll be able to field those together and answer specific things that you're wondering about. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Deborah. And thank you for being here after teaching for a couple hours too. Really appreciate the commitment. All right, y'all, we're going to open things up to answering questions now. We've already received several through the Q&A box, and I welcome everyone else to continue to either add questions or if you think of any to go ahead and please do add them. The three of us will try to field the questions as they come. If we happen to go through for the next 10-15 minutes and we didn't answer your question, go ahead and please put it in there again just to make sure that we to see it as we scroll down. But also note that if we may not answer, it might just be a very niche question. And so we do ask you to go ahead and send us an email, and we will make sure to try to respond to it in a timely manner. All right, with that, let's kick things off with the questions.
There are a couple of questions here that are kind of like about university policies. Could you take those? So one is about whether if you're a co-PI on another grant, can you still dedicate some of your time to this? And if the funding goes through the university, does the university take overhead? Could you address those?
Yeah, so for the overhead one, there is no overhead allowance here. The money is to go directly to the fellow. That is something that if you do become a fellow when it comes to the funding, we very much recommend that you work with your institution on the administration of the funds. We do provide language to assist you when it comes to the negotiation with your institution. But the way that the funds are stipulated by the Spencer Foundation, there is no overhead that is permissible. When it comes to the first question, I'll read out loud. What if I'm a co-PI on a previously funded grant? Can I still dedicate some portion of my time? This is one that we will need to discuss with you when the time comes, because there's a couple things here. One is the intent behind this fellowship is to really buy out your time and also to provide you with salary. To that end, the intent is that you would be working on this for a year. Now, we do have people, and that would be the sole focus of your time. Now, we do have many fellows that will work on this part-time over the course of 2 years, let's say. And in that situation, what we might find ourselves seeing is where a fellow might, for one semester, work full-time on the fellowship. Then the next semester, they might teach, or they might, be working on another project, and then come back and work full-time on the fellowship, and then, cycle on and off. We will work with you, your institution, and anyone else that we need to, in order to be able to help facilitate any kind of breakdown that you need. But really, the point here is for you to focus entirely onto the grant that you're funded for by the NAEd Spencer Foundation.
I can take the next one.
Sure.
So there's a question about whether the candidate's university rankings or CV bear on the selection, or whether we're really reviewing the merit of the proposal. We're completely evaluating the merit of the proposal, the feasibility of it, the other evidence that you're able to carry out what you're proposing. It's not about the ranking of the university. Your CV matters only in the sense that we'd be looking to see whether the kinds of work you've done suggest that you're ready to do the project that you're proposing. In that sense, it would matter, but it's really directly related to the work and what you're proposing to do. So another question is whether the committee provides feedback for unsuccessful proposals, and we do. Do you want to say something, Jack, about how that happens?
Sure. So this is actually a change that's happened over the last couple of years, and we provide feedback on all proposals, successful and unsuccessful now. The way that this works is that over the course of the application period, or I should say over the course of the review period, we will receive feedback from all the different reviewers, both external and selection committee reviewers. We will then collect that feedback. Staff will go through and make sure that to clean up the feedback that we receive, and then we will provide the feedback to the applicants. There isn't a lot of changing that we as staff will do, so the feedback that you receive will be, for the most part, what is written by the reviewers. We have done this for several reasons, but one reason is that we want to make sure to provide as much assistance to applicants, especially those who do not make it, so that if they're interested in applying in the future, they have some feedback that they can work on. And if not, then they have some feedback that can also support them in their research moving forward.
I see a handful of questions about how many letters of recommendations are needed and if there's a particular format. So we need 3 letters of recommendation. And when you go into the application portal, you're able to write their name, their email, and their relationship with you. And so once we get that information, there's an automated email that asks them for like 2 or 3 questions, but there's no particular format that the letters of recommendation need to be in. Besides that, we just recommend that they're in PDF format and that they use the link to upload that information.
So we have a question here about just the timeline again of when an applicant must have received their PhD or EDD. The dates that we have are, I want to make sure I say it correctly. I just had it here.
2018 to 2018. Yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So you must have received your degree. It must be in hand between January 1st of 2018 and December 31st of 2022. If you have received your degree after this timeline, so anytime during 2023, you are not eligible to apply for the postdoctoral fellowship this year. However, you will be eligible to apply next year and for the 4 years that follow after that. This is something that has been a long-standing tradition when it comes to the NAEd Spencer Fellowship, and we will not be making any changes to it. And again, it means that you have graduated, you have your degree in hand, and that you have completed all the different components.
Is there a way for people to get help later in the application process?
Would there be anyone we can reach out to later? If there are at any point that you have questions when it comes to what the application might be asking you, then please do feel free to reach out to NAEd staff, info@naeducation.org. That's our email. We have it up there on the screen as well. And we'll be happy to try to clarify any of the questions that are being asked.
There are a few questions about sort of where you might be with your work when you apply. So, and also what it was about, a couple of questions about types of research. Is the committee interested in methodological research or meta-analyses? The committee doesn't have particular interest. I would say the main thing to consider is that this is funding education research. So you want to be clear that the work you're doing bears somehow on the rather broad field of education, which might sound sort of obvious, but we do sometimes get applications that really aren't related to education. So that's a good question to ask. But within that range, it's not that there's a particular interest in some method or some kind of focus. There's some questions about whether you might already have your data or already started to conduct your study, and that's fine, but it's also not necessary. Some people are asking, is it necessary that you already have your data? No. But if you do already have data, you're proposing then to do something with data that you have. So again, it's really about what you're planning to study, the feasibility, what you're going to be using that's important to be specific about in the narrative. There isn't a preference for practical versus pure or exploratory research. I think, again, the question is being clear about what the problem or question is that you're pursuing and how it's relevant to education, which is central to this. Jack, do you want to take a question, or Taylor, on what the limitations are on how the money can be used?
Sure, I can take this one. And then Taylor, could you look up the exact language we have when it comes to the NAEd Spencer or Spencer Research Grants?
Sure. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay. All right. So the question here, when it comes to the money, again, the intent is to really buy out your time and for you to be, and for this to be used as like salary so that you could focus your time on your research. There is the funding cannot be used for overhead or indirect costs. Outside of that, you may use the funds to really support you in writing your postdoctoral in conducting your research for your fellowship. Sorry, I'm getting the other fellowship here confused. So the purpose here is to focus on your research. The funding also will not be used to support your travel or your lodging when it comes to the retreats that we will be hosting more often in Washington, D.C. And that's because we will fund that. So whenever we have trips that are professional development based for a fellowship, the NAEd will cover your lodging and any other expenses that are associated with it. Taylor, are you ready?
Sure. So fellows may not receive other concurrent funding for their project during the tenure of the fellowship. Fellows may not hold a separate grant from the Spencer Foundation during the fellowship period. Fellows must receive approval from the project for a, oh, no, that's it. So when it comes to concurrent funding, we do not accept, it's not permitted.
There's a bunch of questions about timelines or length of project that I can answer. Some people are asking, is it possible to propose something that will take more than 2 years and extend beyond the fellowship? Or is there a preference for 1-year projects over 2-year projects? I think it's been clear that it's possible to spread it over 2 years. But yes, if you would propose something that's going longer than the 2 years, that's going to be one of those cases where we feel like it's not feasible, because you should be proposing something that can be done within the scope of the fellowship. So if you have something that you plan to do longer, I'd advise planning the part that you're proposing for your fellowship to be discrete and show what you're going to accomplish with the fellowship, even if you can show briefly how you're going to extend it later. But I would not make that part of the proposal, because that will seem to be then unfeasible for the fellowship. Some of you are also asking about having to identify a mentor, and I think that makes sense because lots of postdocs do require that. This is not that kind of a postdoc. You don't need to have identified a mentor or someone to work with you on this project. You will have opportunities to interact with senior scholars along the way during your fellowship time, but you don't have to have picked somebody for that. The most important here is what you're proposing to do and being clear about that. There was also a question about the status of your letter writers or seniority of your letter writers. I think what's most important is that it be somebody who knows you well, knows your work well, and is able to really attest to the preparation you have to carry out the project you have in mind. So they should know what you're proposing. A letter that just talks in general about you but doesn't connect to your project isn't as helpful. And although I would like to say that we could accept letters that are written in other languages, we won't very likely be able to read those. So that isn't actually very useful to us. So it would be most useful if letters that have to originally be written in another language be translated in the submission, because the committee won't be able to read them if they're not languages that we know.
Yeah. That's accurate. We must, the application must be submitted in English for our reviewers to be able to conduct a review. We do have a question here about, I created the application last year but could not submit it. In that case, you should go ahead and create a new application. If you try to submit your application from last year, it will not go through the system. So you have to create a new application this year. Mentor. Sorry, I'm trying to catch up on some of these questions.
Yeah.
There's a question about the scope of the project. It's not expected that you write a book out of it or write some number of papers or one paper. I think saying what you plan to produce out of it is useful, but there's not some expectation about exactly what that scope would be. Again, the important thing is that it be a clearly defined question and problem area, that you really are convincing about what's important about this, how it builds on other work, and what you're planning to carry out in considerable detail. Sometimes we see applications that have so much at the front end about the justification for the work, but we don't get enough sense what the project will really be. So really think about using the space well to balance between showing what's important and how it connects to what are you really planning to do and what do you expect to produce out of it. But there isn't an expectation about exactly what those products and their form would be.
We have questions coming in about whether or not applicants can add additional material than what is requested. Please don't. So there's already a lot of material that we do request when it comes to the recommendations, previous publication, etc. Since our reviewers' time is very important, and with the material that they receive, they will only review what is required. So if you do add anything additional, one, I don't think the system will allow it, but just in case it does, two, the reviewers will not be reviewing that information. So please do stick to what is being requested by the application.
Someone had asked a question if there are any restrictions if you had received the NAEd dissertation fellowship. We don't have any restrictions as to whether you are not able to apply for the postdoc if you've been awarded the dissertation in the past. So you still are eligible to apply if you were awarded the dissertation.
So Deborah, a question here for you. Do you have any suggestions for reapplicants?
Yeah, we see many applications for reapplicants, and we definitely encourage them. It's important to take account of the feedback that you received on it and use that. But we see many people applying more than once and being successful with subsequent applications. So we definitely encourage it.
Thanks.
Someone
There's a
had asked a
question. Go ahead, Taylor. Yeah.
Sure. So someone had asked a question if there are additional resources when it comes to writing the application. On our webpage, we do have a separate page that provides people more resources when it comes to applications, for example, like how to write a grant proposal, or the difference between like qualitative and quantitative research, and how to really like create that narrative in order to make sure that the proposal is concrete and that everything is understood. So on our website, we do have additional resources.
We have a question here about just examples of previous research that has been funded. We don't provide through our website, we don't provide like final reports or a scope of what the projects were. What we do provide on our website is where you can find previously funded fellows, a bio and abstract. We have cohort lists under the Spencer Postdoctoral Fellowship page. If you go to the very bottom, you'll see a cohort list for each year. From there, if you would like to do more research on what the finished project was, then I welcome you to do a little research by going to their, probably their university bios or their online website presence, and then reading the proposal and or the final work that they may have published online.
There's a question about whether the Spencer Foundation has stated positions on the most important issues or perspectives in education research. And does the Spencer Foundation try to fund areas of work that the National Science Foundation or the Institute for Education Sciences don't fund? I think that's a question really more generally about the Spencer Foundation. And while the Spencer Foundation funds these fellowships, this is also a project of the National Academy of Education, who has a commitment to building the field and bringing up new scholars in the field. So there isn't any particular set of issues that the project of this fellowship program is prioritizing. Again, I think the important thing is to be able to argue for yourself why something is a crucial issue for education research, and to keep thinking like what comprises education research and make that argument on behalf of what you're proposing.
We have a question that someone had asked about what happens when you switch universities halfway through the fellowship year. If you are awarded the fellowship, we do have policies in place to help you migrate those funds from one institution to another. So if you're teeter-tottering or you're about to accept a new position, we do have policies in place to help you migrate.
All right, another question here about timeline. If you were awarded the PhD in December 2021, is this my last opportunity to apply? It's not. You have 3 more chances to apply after this one, I think. So you still have a few more opportunities if you decide not to apply this year. Another question here, Deborah, about just reapplicants. So in our application, we do ask them to provide a short description regarding their previous application. When it comes to that short description, are there certain things that you're looking for, or like FYI purposes or something else?
I think just trying to understand what you thought about from your first submission to this submission, or from your last submission to this one, what you took up and what kinds of changes you tried to make are very helpful for us to understand how you're thinking about the revision and the refocusing or development of your project.
Someone asked a question about regular teaching being paid. What our fellowship hopes to do is for you to be able to take a year off of leave. And so teaching is not permitted while you are working on the fellowship.
But again, we can, like we were talking about earlier, we can like stack it so that if you, one semester you're on teaching, one semester your fellowship, one semester teaching, one semester fellowship, but it's not supposed to be concurrent.
Here's a question about what happens, and this is certainly, I think many people could experience this. But suppose you get funded and you're a fellow and something in your plan doesn't really quite work out the way you intended. For example, you can't recruit the participants you planned, or something doesn't work out with a site. What happens then, Jack?
From there, so a few different things. One, notify us, and then we'll work with you or your institution or your site to try to figure out the best way to move forward. But for the most part, keep communicating with us. Now, if your fellowship is complete, or if your research proposal cannot work at all because something didn't pan out, that would be a much bigger discussion that we have to go through with you. I can't recall if that's happened in the past, but the what if. But in the end, it's just because each situation is very different depending on the different methodological approaches that people are taking. We just ask you to let us know, and then we'll work with you to try to figure out how to best move forward.
Is it possible to share the link to past fellowship awardees that you mentioned? Could you share it in the chat window, in the Q&A window?
I'll post
I
that.
can pull that up.
All right.
There's a question about whether you have to be on leave during your work. I can see that lots of things about this are a little bit hard to place and to understand. You're not on leave, but you would not be teaching during the semesters or the year that you're drawing on the fellowship. So you're not technically on leave, but you're released from the other responsibilities you have so that you can focus on your work. It's really a way of getting focused time to advance your scholarship earlier in your career than when you typically would be eligible for that from an institution. Can you say something about funding rates, Jack, about how many applicants we often get? And
several hundred.
We know that we.
Yeah. So every year we receive several hundred. It'll fluctuate a little bit within that. That we then send to external reviewers and the selection committee to drill down as much as possible to the 25 awardees. I believe it's 25 to the 25 applicants who will receive the fellowship. So all that to say is that there are way more applicants who are very highly qualified than we have the opportunity to fund. And because of that, it's very important to really review the material that you're submitting and make sure all the I's are dotted, all the T's are crossed, make sure everything is as strongly written as you possibly can make it. And also make sure that you, just a general good practice, can be broadly read. So just in case you're like very much into a very niche discipline, try to get someone outside of it to review your proposal and make sure that they're able to understand it, because we do have a selection committee of different disciplines represented, and you want to make sure that anyone can pick it up and have a pretty good understanding of what it is that you're trying to do during your fellowship period. Because Deborah, I'm sure you can share, there's a lot of discussion that goes into each applicant, and folks need to be able to understand what you're trying to do. All right. Just a reminder to all applicants, you do not have to be affiliated with a university. Something that's really great about this postdoctoral fellowship, not US based, not US citizenship, not university based. It really is reviewing the merits of your proposal, and then we will work to fund you. If you are with an institution, we will work with your institution. We will also provide you guidance on how best to work with your institution to be able to move forward. But if you're not, then we will fund you directly, and we will also provide you with support on how to move forward with that as well. We're just trying to go through all the questions here to make sure we've answered them.
I think in terms of the resubmission, there's a question about my what to submit. So the applicant portal instructs you to resubmit the abstract of the past application, but in writing the narrative, you can explain changes that you've been making. So both are true. But you should submit the abstract of the previous one so we can compare that with the new one. There's a question about whether it's advisable to get the approval of your department chair or dean. The process doesn't ask you for that, but it would be probably wise to be discussing with somebody with whom you work that you're submitting this, because it will be important for your institution to be supportive of you if you were to be awarded the fellowship. So I would advise that, but it's not part of the process on our end.
There is a question in the application that does ask that, but it's just a yes or no. If you haven't had that conversation yet, it's not a penalty.
There are quite a few questions about whether this can be related to other work, other publication you're doing, other projects you have, other data you have. Again, all of that is okay. The most important thing is that it be new work that you're doing in the context of things that you're doing that builds on work you've done. That can be a real advantage. It shouldn't duplicate something you've already completed. But if you have data or you're building a line of work, that's one of the ways that this can be really helpful to you in growing your line of scholarship. So be clear about what you have done and what it's building on. You don't have to have published about this already, but if you have, it's not a disadvantage. It's not, these things aren't that, they aren't either or. It's really about getting clear about what you're proposing for this and how it builds on other people's work and how it's connected to your work and that it be doable. So as specific as you can be will really help. There's a question about whether you have to propose something that you can be completely done with in the 2-year period. I think it's reasonable to expect you might not have papers published from a project that you begin and you're conducting for 2 years, but you should have a clear sense of what your questions are, what you're going to carry out, what the analyses would be, and what you expect to complete within the timeline of the project. And I'm sorry if it doesn't feel clear enough, but it shouldn't seem like it's just going to extend onward after you complete the work. There should be some clear things you expect to produce or to have figured out. And undoubtedly, you'll continue to build on that, but you should have a complete project that you're laying out.
We have a question here if there's any statistical information about previous awardee academic status. We don't have anything like that published. Yeah, we don't have anything like that posted of where people are when they first apply and then where people are, 5 years later.
I did try to answer the question about what the scope of the project would be, so I don't know if this is duplicating, but we don't have in mind that it's either answerable in a book or 2 papers or 1 paper. That's really has to do a lot with the kind of work that you do. I think it'd be wise to say what you're planning to produce out of it, but we don't have a specific idea in mind. It's more that you should link that to what you're proposing to do and the logic of your work. Can people defer the start of the Spencer postdoc if they hold another position?
I was just about to answer that one. Yeah. So the application starting period is between July 1st of 2024 and I believe as far as January 1st of 2025. Within that period, you may begin. So if you have to wait until January 1st-ish of 2025 to begin the postdoctoral fellowship, that is okay. It just needs to take place within the next academic year. That's the requirement. We will then work with you to figure out how to break it apart, whether that be 9 months, 12 months, 18 months, or 24 months that this fellowship period will take place. So you have a few options there.
There's a question about how to prepare your CV. Your CV should be prepared in ways that look similar to the way you might apply for a job or for any other kind of any proposal you might write. A fairly standard academic format. I think you can see examples of those. But that's something you could ask a question about if you're uncertain.
With these examples, or you made me think that when it comes to additional resources to review, I highly recommend in the link that we put in the chat. You're going to see a few different resources there that we do recommend that applicants should check out. Under the quick links section, you'll see FAQs, guidelines, and then additional applicant resources. Within that, you'll see a few different guides. One is writing successful research grant proposals. Another is communicating your qualitative research design. And then finally, and then tomorrow, a guide to quantitative proposals, and then on the art of writing proposals. These are fantastic resources that have really benefited applicants in the past. So I do recommend that if you have yet to review those documents, that you go ahead and take the time to do so before you submit your application. The average acceptance rate of proposals, I think you mean the folks who are applying what the average, or is it the other way? So anyway, if we have 25 fellowships that we're able to award, it's near 100% by the application rate of people who are accepting it. Once we award them the fellowship, there might be one or two for different reasons they have to turn it down, but for the most part, it's 100% acceptance rate. Of the number of proposals that we receive that then become a fellow, I'm trying to remember how many we've had in the last couple of years. I know it's a few hundred. So we're looking at maybe less than 10% of applicants who apply that end up becoming the fellowship or end up getting the fellowship.
Jack, can you answer this question? Most of the postdoc fellowships seem to have been given to people who are already assistant professors. And how does it work to have a faculty position and a postdoc fellowship at the same time?
Yeah.
Is that a question about if you are already an assistant professor and you get this, how does that work? Maybe that's what the question is.
If you're already an assistant professor, then this should work out fine for you. If you're already a postdoc fellow, that means that you're receiving funding from a different source, then we most likely cannot support you in your research. Again, when it comes to concurrent funding, the purpose of this fellowship is to buy out your time. So if you are receiving funding from a different source, we won't be able to support you in this way until that other source of funding has ended. But if it's as an assistant professor, you should be fine with this fellowship.
So are travel costs built into the funding?
They're not. They're additional that we will cover.
And that you mean for coming to the retreats?
For coming to the retreats, yeah.
What about if you have to travel to another country to collect data?
That would be part of your fellowship. So that can be funding that you receive through for the fellowship, or maybe if there's some institutional funding that you're receiving in order to support you, that's supportive as well. But this fellowship really is being given to you either for salary purposes or for you to be able to help advance your research. When it comes to negotiation with your institution, we will provide you with resources in order to support you in the negotiations with your institution. If you require more assistance after that, then please do reach out to NAEd staff, and we'll be happy to help support you in the negotiation with your institution. For the way that you write your submissions or any kind of bibliography, whether that be APA or another style, it's up to you. Just make sure that you are consistent throughout the proposal and the submission that you in your submission.
I'm just scrolling through again.
Mm-hmm.
Just reviewing some of these different items here that make sure we haven't answered them yet.
So I think the implication of the funding is that somebody could try to get some money to pay for participant stipends or something like that. That wouldn't be disallowed, right? At the same time, like if your university has research funds, you could apply for to get money for carrying out the research. Is that disallowed?
I believe that's allowed, but for that question, I need to review the material. So if you could just email us, we'll make sure to review our information and provide you with accurate information.
Someone had asked if we could, if they could provide an additional fourth recommendation. Our application portal only allows for 3.
I think we'll go ahead.
A lot of these questions are, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say a lot of the questions understandably have a lot to do with being clear about the process and, you know, all these aspects of it, which is a lot to keep track of. But I don't think I can overemphasize the importance of the two things you really have control over, which is the description of your proposal and your personal statement, because those really are the things that communicate about how you think you can best take advantage of this somewhat unusual opportunity that's not a postdoc working for somebody else. It's really an opportunity relatively earlier in your career to have the space and time to advance something that you find really compelling or that builds on work you've been doing that you wouldn't otherwise have the space to do. And I think what's really important is to give yourself a lot of time or effort to work on that, because that really is in the end what will differentiate your proposal, is to be as clear as you can about the parts I've mentioned. What's the problem space or domain? Like, who else has worked on this? Why is this so important? How does it relate to who you are? And then plenty of work describing like what you're actually going to do and how that relates to your questions, how you're going to analyze the data, what you imagine that it will come out of this. That's really, really important. And also telling about who you are, that's really important. And I understand why we're talking about these other questions, but I just want to really emphasize that the success of your proposal will have a lot to do with that, those two things.
Thanks. I think that's a nice way to close it out too. So thank you for doing that. And Taylor is going to be putting up the slide on the screen one more time, just to make sure everybody is able to jot down our email address, just in case you want to ask us further questions, or maybe we didn't get to your question. Please feel free to email us at info@naeducation.org. And we will be happy to answer your questions. And in there, you can be as specific as you like, and we will try to be as specific as possible as well. And with that, a big thank you to my colleague Taylor, and of course to Dr. Deborah Loringer-Ball for answering all these questions and being here with us today. We appreciate all of you, and we look forward to reviewing your applications.
Best wishes to all of you on this process.
Thank you.